Welcome to the Community Builders Forum. This is a monthly webinar by the Fellowship for Intentional Community. My name is Sky Blue and I am the Executive Director of the FIC. This month's topic is on eco-villages and the global movement of eco-villages. Our presenter today is Daniel Greenberg, who is currently the president of the Global Eco-Village Network. And just by way, a little way of introduction, I wanted to share that I remember in 2000 being a 19-year-old new member living at Twin Oaks Community and hearing about this new Living Roots program and this guy Daniel Greenberg who started it. And also around that time starting to hear about the Eco-Village Network of the Americas, which I believe was kind of still in the forming stages at that point, and of course Global Eco-Village Network. And I think that was when I really first started having a clue that this intentional communities thing was actually part of a global movement. And so then a couple of years ago, getting to go to Findhorn Eco Village in Scotland to Jen's 20th anniversary and get to meet people from literally around the world doing this stuff was a pretty amazing experience. And one of the things that was most striking for me was that beyond the obvious linguistic and cultural differences of people there was something just so strikingly similar about the worldview of all of these people and the endeavors that they were engaged in from around the world. And there really was this sense of feeling of family, of like kind of global family, and the sense of global solidarity that I think is really important for people in the US in particular to be connected to. So yeah, I just wanted to share a little bit of that before we kind of got into what Daniel has to share with us. And just to let everybody know, you have the ability while the presentation is happening to use the chat function, use the Q&A function. We're probably mostly gonna have Daniel just sort of roll through his presentation, but if you wanna throw stuff out, I might be able to interject some stuff during the presentation. Otherwise, it'll be saved and we'll do a Q&A session at the end. And at the end, when we do that, not only will you have a chance to write questions, but if you so choose, you can actually come in live and be seen and heard and join the conversation. So without further ado, Daniel, why don't you tell us a little bit more about your background and then take it away.
Great. Well, thank you, Sky, also for making me feel old. I actually realized that, so I'll go back a little bit further. And, you know, my journey really began back in the mid-'80s, late 80s, and I was pursuing a PhD program in child development and school psychology. And my topic was children and growing up in communes or intentional communities. And gosh, I probably studied the topic for maybe 2 years before my wife, Monique, and I set foot into a Westphalia camper van, and we traveled to about 40 communities across North America. And it was amazing. And I often say that I think I learned more the first day that I stepped foot in one of these communities than probably those 2 years I had spent studying them. And then we ended up going to Findhorn, a community in Scotland, where we worked with children and families there. And it was at Findhorn that I became inspired to start Living Roots, which I'll mention a little bit later. But also while we were traveling around North America, Monique had the privilege of creating a video documentary called Follow the Dirt Road. And if anyone's actually ever heard of that, put it in the chat, because I'm curious. I actually found recently an early version of it. This was back in the days of analog editing, and so, you know, it's a big reel-to-reel kind of thing. So I'm hoping to digitize it, maybe get it into the FIC bookstore soon. But with that said, what I want to do today is introduce you to the Global Eco-Village Network, and I want to show you some images of some eco-villages around the world and tell you a little bit about the organization and the network and maybe another organization or two. And I'll start with sort of the big picture, the why. And I suspect I'm preaching to the converted. If you're in this webinar, you're already aware that we are facing many, many dire issues on this planet. And that if we want to get through this bottleneck that we're facing as a species, we really need to reimagine and transform almost everything that we do. And the way I think about it is we need to do that sort of in two ways. on one level, we need to raise the quality of life of everyone on this planet above what I would call an equity baseline, where everyone can have access to clean water and good shelter and medical facilities and education, right? And the sad truth is that there are billions of people on this planet that are not living at even just an equity baseline of quality of life. So that's one direction that we need to transform things. And then obviously the other direction is that we need to reduce our local and global ecological footprint below the carrying capacity of our planet, right? And so we need to get into this livable zone if we're going to thrive as a species. And the sad truth also is that very few countries are both below the carrying capacity of the planet and in general, the population is above an equity baseline. And so what ecovillages are, essentially, they're experiments, and they're trying to create communities that are living high quality lifestyles with low ecological impacts. And so my simple definition of an ecovillage is it's just a group of people that are trying to live well and lightly together. And that's what does it for me. And of course, there are amazing locations. If you've been to other communities, you also know how transformative they can be personally, professionally, emotionally, even spiritually, and how amazing they are as campuses for us to learn about how we might live in harmony with each other and the planet. And also, if you think about those two directions, the bottom up and the top down, it helps to think about ecovillages in sort of two areas as well. In that top down, where we're trying to reduce our ecological footprint, these are ecovillages typically in developed countries where people are saying, hey, look, we're already living pretty well. How do we maintain that quality of life while lowering our ecological footprint? So Findhorn, a community in Scotland that I mentioned, is a good example of this, and there may be 600 people there. And I'll mention Findhorn again in a few minutes. And the other direction, there are indigenous communities and populations, villages that have been around maybe hundreds, if not thousands of years. And they're saying, hey, look, we want to develop, we want to increase our quality of life. But how do we do that while at the same time preserving our resources, our culture? And so they're also looking to the ecovillage model as providing some wisdom of how they might do that. But they're all trying to get to the same middle ground. Again, how do we live well and lightly together? So that's my definition. The global ecovillage definition is an ecovillage is a community using participatory design processes to integrate the ecological, economic, social, and cultural dimensions of sustainability into a whole systems pathway toward a regenerative future. And you see these four dimensions, and I'll come back to them in a second also when I talk about Gaia education. And then Jen is also really looking at the holistic whole system design of this. So that's a nice definition as well. So what is the Global Ecovillage Network? Well, it started in 1995, and it is an amazing network of communities around the world that are in this experimental phase. They're all different. If you could imagine what one might look like, there's probably one out there that might approximate it. And you can find out more information. They have a really good website at www.ecovillage.org. And the Global Ecovillage Network is divided into 5 regions. And I think you can see my cursor. Originally, there were 3 regions. We were in ENA, Sky actually mentioned, the Ecovillage Network of the Americas. And then we've been in the last few years in the process of splitting as Casa Latina, or the Global Ecovillage Network of Latin America, has emerged, and that has left North America to reform as its own region. A similar thing happened in Europe. Europe and Africa were originally one region. The idea is really trying to bridge the North and the South, and there was a lot of that going on. And then Africa said, well, we really want our own region. It sounds kind of grandiose, doesn't it? Africa wants its own region. And so this was very exciting when Gen Africa arose a number of years ago. And then now Gen Europe is probably the most active region in Gen right now. And then there's Genoa of Oceania and Asia, which covers a wide swath of area over here. And then to get things even more complicated, you don't have to read this, but generally, Gen can be thought of as both an organization and a network. On the left hand is sort of the organizational side where there's staff. It's actually located in Scotland, where a lot of the activities, education, research, a lot of outreach, et cetera, are happening. And then on the right, there's the network is primarily constituted by the Gen board. And so, as Sky mentioned, I have the privilege of sitting right in the middle of this as chair or president of the board. And so there are representatives from each of the region, and we meet monthly. And it's a wonderful place for cross-fertilization, creating policy. We're actually now starting a process of really looking at some of the definitions and how do we really how do we talk about this in a way that can appeal to the masses, but also governments and the UN and things. It's an interesting topic. And I'm just sort of thinking about this in some ways. The network is sort of the inflow of energy. And I guess you could think of the organization as how it is outflowing and manifesting in the world. And then just to show some data, I actually don't know where this data comes from, but I think it's true. There's a lot of governments now interested in GEN. Many governments have signed on to the Paris agreements and have made some fairly significant goals with relation to climate change. And now they're saying, well, how do we actually do that? And they're realizing that the grassroots efforts of ecovillages are a really amazing avenue for them. So they're looking at how they can engage with GEN to further a lot of their goals. GEN is creating a consultancy. This is still fairly much in its early stages, but we're very excited about utilizing all of the wisdom and expertise within ecovillages around the world to support both ecovillage development, but also other development in surrounding communities and regions. If you go to the website, you can pretty easily find the solution library where people and organizations are encouraged to put in positive news, things that are happening and ideas that might be replicated elsewhere. And this is growing into a really valuable resource. A lot of the materials are in different languages. GEN has a lot of ambassadors, and this is a growing group of people that are talking about ecovillages and sustainability around the world. And if you're interested, there's information on the website of how to do that. This is not 5.0 volunteer hours. You know, in Europe, they often put a period instead of a comma. So they're talking about 5,000 volunteer hours. I'm sure it's a lot more than that, actually. So a lot of people are giving their time and energy to this effort. And there's a fast growing number of partnerships that GEN is developing as well. In fact, just yesterday, I was on a call to really look at kind of concretizing the partnership between GEN and the FIC. And there's wonderful opportunities there, particularly with databases and directories and things, but many other opportunities as well. And then GEN is focusing on a number of programs, including Ecovillage incubation. How do we help ecovillages get off the ground? Ecovillage development, projects that are ecovillage related. There's a greening schools initiative. There's something called emergencies, if you get the little twist there, emergencies, also refugen. And so these are looking at areas in crisis, not as first responders, but really coming in at that place where a place that has gone through a catastrophe is looking to rebuild. And we can come in with expertise and resources to say, look, you don't actually have to do the same mistakes that you made the first time. You can actually do things differently this time. And there's also an urban eco-neighborhood program that's evolving as well. And a few more things, lots of website visitors. You can join the newsletter. The newsletters are quite good. Lots of Facebook likes. We also do webinars, and more GEN trainers are out there. We sometimes say that GEN is connected to 10,000 ecovillages. I'm not sure if that's true. It's a little tricky to say. I mean, there are places like Sri Lanka, which on its own, there's 7,000 to 8,000 villages that are trying to develop as ecovillages. So if you count them, then yeah, it's 10,000. Brazil, there's also a lot of ecovillages showing up. My guess is that there are probably a few hundred really active ecovillages, and then there are thousands others that are more on the periphery, but we're trying to reach out to them and make more networking activities with them. And then we talk about some showcase ecovillages, and I'll show you a few of those in a few minutes. And then we're developing some assessments of saying, well, how are they doing? And also this is part of a larger research endeavor. Lots of people did many master's and PhD theses have been done on ecovillages around the world, and we want to support that. And then there's also efforts in GEN to do some work with women around the world as well. And then before I talk about some more of the ecovillages, I do want to mention another organization called Gaia Education. This originally came out of GEN and was the education arm of GEN, and then it became its own organization and now is really a sister. They're doing quite well themselves. And Gaia Education You can find them at guyeducation.org. They also have a wonderful website. And years ago, I also had the privilege of being part of this group. We called ourselves the Geese. Let me see if I can remember, the Global Ecovillage Educators, Ecovillage Design Educators for a Sustainable Earth, something like that. So there was a group of Ecovillage educators around the world that came together over a series of meetings to develop a curriculum. And here you see a 4-week comprehensive course in the fundamentals of sustainability design. And it's been evolving over the years. This is back from 2012. You can actually freely download this from their website, and it's an amazing resource. And essentially what it is looking at sustainability within these 4 dimensions that we also saw within GEN. So the social, economic, and ecological, these are sort of the 3 pillars. These are the ones that you hear mostly about. And then we added a worldview, or if we can get away with it, a spiritual dimension, because we feel that our beliefs, our stories, our worldviews are really at the core of what we do. And if we changed all of these things, but we didn't change our worldview, we were just going to recreate the same thing. So really, how do we look at reconnecting with nature, transforming our consciousness, personal and planetary health, etc. And I don't know if you can read these, it might be small on your screen, but each of these dimensions have 5 modules. So there's 20 in all. And really, this is the stuff we should be learning in kindergarten. This is the stuff really about how do we operationalize sustainability? How do we live in harmony with each other and the planet? And so the curriculum is really spreading that out, and Ecovillages are ideal campuses in which to teach this. And that's a segue a little bit to my own story quickly. I mentioned my early story, and then when I came back from Findhorn, I was inspired to start a nonprofit called Living Roots, which partnered with UMass Amherst, and we ran study abroad programs in ecovillages around the world. And we, in the end, I think there was about 1,500 students that went through our program, semester, summer, January programs, amazing experiences. And I left Living Roots in 2012 to start another social venture. I can't seem to get it out of my blood, called Earth Deeds, which is an alternative to carbon offsetting and helps people meaningfully account for their unavoidable travel emissions. And then sadly, Living Roots ended in 2014. And so more recently, I've tried to re-energize these ideas. A lot of people came to me and said, all the materials from Living Roots came to me, and people were saying, well, how are we going to recreate these programs? And in the end, I decided rather than creating a nonprofit that creates its own programs and then tries to market it to students, I set up a consultancy called CAPE, which is helping develop custom academic programs in ecovillages. So one of our target audiences is faculty who might want to do a faculty-led program in an ecovillage and say, well, that's a great idea, but I don't know how to do that. Well, we do. And this is what I've been doing for a couple of decades. So if you know any faculty that might be interested in taking a group of students to an ecovillage, send them my way. And so there's a lot of ecovillages out there that are potential sites. And I want to show just a few of these just to give you a sense of what's out there. There's Oroville. Oroville is probably the largest ecovillage in the world, and it may be the largest intentional community. I'm not sure, Sky might know that as well. There's currently somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 people there from around 45 different nations. They will be celebrating their 50th anniversary next February. And the top left, here you see this amazing structure in the back. It's called the Matrimondier. And it is essentially a meditation sanctuary. It's not a place for religions. Oroville is not a religious community, but it is a spiritual community. This is a place just to go and be silent. And it's at the very center of the community. And this is at a birthday celebration. And this is a large solar dish. This is actually probably 20, 30 meters across. And the heat that is generated from this solar panel helps create food for about 1,500 people a day. It's a large community. It's about 14 square kilometers. And it's really my second favorite place on the planet. I think I'd say Findhorn is my favorite. But Oroville is really, if you have any opportunity to get there, let me know and I'll put you in touch with people. And then comes Findhorn, which is probably the best known ecovillage in the world. They celebrated their 50th anniversary a few years ago in 2012. And also an amazing place. This is this was actually at a birthday celebration. I'm in here somewhere, probably in the middle there. And Findhorn often says that Well, one of the mottos at Findhorn is work is love in action. I won't go into the whole history of Findhorn, which is fascinating, but I find that motto wonderful. And you just walk around and you feel it. I mean, just look at this. This is the Universal Hall, where there's large events that happen there. There's a cafe, there's music recording studios, but it's just beautiful. And also, there's a whole neighborhood that's sort of like out of The Hobbit. These are houses, excuse me, that are built out of old whiskey barrels. And I mean, it's Scotland, right? So there was a company that was moving from wood vats to metal vats, and I can't remember if they got them free or if they're very cheap. But these wood vats were sort of piling up in a corner of Findhorn, and then this guy Roger decided, well, hey, you know what? I could live in one of those. So he built his house, and now there's like a little neighborhood, a little community of these barrel houses, and they're very beautiful. And so I find just walking around Findhorn, I just feel a rise in my consciousness, and that's part of the idea there as well. In the background here, you can also see another neighborhood that has been created with ecological materials. So Findhorn, I could say a lot more, but let me move on, and if people have questions, we can come back to it. And then a spin-off of Findhorn is a community called Sirius. And Sirius started in 1978 by 4 ex-members of Findhorn. And it's in Western Massachusetts, and it's a smaller community. It's about 90 acres and currently maybe 40 members. They have a beautiful community center. Here you can see a greenhouse, which you can eat in, which is a wonderful thing in the swing seasons in the winter to actually see things growing. There's photovoltaics and passive solar and active solar on the roof. This is actually upstairs in the octagon for obvious reasons. And again, like Findhorn, there's a lot of attention paid to the subtle things. You know, if you look around, maybe even where you're living, where you are right now, but in most environments that we're in, they're telling a story of separation from the natural world. And there's linear walls, and maybe you look outside, but you don't see a whole lot. In ecovillages, often a priority is to say, how do we build in a way that connects people to the environment? So the barrow houses were an example of this. And here in the octagon, you might notice that there's 8 spokes of wood on the floor, and each of those are different types of hardwood. And I've always said that they should have a little plaque on the wall here to say which kind of wood that is. But, you know, you're sitting there and you're like, huh, those are different. Oh, you know what? I think that's oak, and that might be maple, and I have no idea what that is. You know, but it gets you questioning, and these are all local to Sirius. In fact, 99% of the wood that is used to build at Sirius comes from within 5 miles of Sirius. So a lot of local materials, and they have wonderful gardens. I lived here for about 17 years, and we may be going back in the summer. We've been up in Canada for the last 2 years. So another wonderful community, and I'll probably go a little faster with some of the others. Damanhur is an amazing community in northern Italy. There's a lot of people, about 600 people there. They actually have their own economy, and they have a number of stores. And they're separated into sub-communities. This is one that you can obviously see is doing a lot of ecological work. And they have something called the Temple for Humanity. I think that's what it's called. And some of the early founders were digging into this mountain at night so that no one would see them. And they did this for years. And then they built this magnificent temple underground as to show the different spiritual paths for humanity. Again, it's not, I would say, a religious community, but it is a spiritual community, recognizing that there are many paths up the mountain. An amazing community. And then Ecocentro IPEC in Brazil is an amazing community in the savannah, the Cerrado in central Brazil, and it is modeled on permaculture techniques. So most of the agriculture and buildings are designed using those principles. Then there's Kibbutz Lotan and the Center for Creative Ecology in Israel, in the Negev, the desert. And so you can kind of see it. I mean, this is amazing. It's just, you get up on a hill and you look down, and it's just this little oasis, and it's like a green dot in the desert. And you're there, and you could think you're just in a suburb somewhere, but it's really in an amazing part of Israel. And they have done great work with local materials and other materials. Here, these are some students building what we called the dormitories. You can see it's kind of a Buckminster Fuller frame, and then they put straw bales and cob around that. So instead of dormitories, they're dormitories. And here's one completed with some photovoltaics. And so they do something called the Green Apprenticeship Program, where people can come for, I think it's around 5 weeks, and learn a lot of their techniques. And they are connected to what's called the Green Kibbutz Group. And it used to be, the Green Kibbutz Group was more active maybe a decade or two ago, but there's still a number of ecovillages, I'm sorry, a number of kibbutzim in Israel that are really thinking ecologically. There's probably over 100 kibbutzim in Israel, and I'd say maybe a dozen of them are really thinking ecologically, or that's one of their primary focuses. Senegal, and as you saw me say earlier, this is an example of sort of the bottom-up approach, where there are villages across Senegal that are trying to develop and are looking to ecovillages for models. And I'm quite proud that when Living Roots was running programs in Senegal, what we did is for every US or Western student that came, we supported a Senegalese student to join the program as well. And for both sides, that was perhaps the most powerful part of the program, that cultural bridging. And we also supported this, at that point, nascent Ecovillage network in Senegal. So I think Living Roots was one of the impetuses for that network to develop. And it has gone crazy, and it's really wonderful. In fact, it's to the point where there is an Ecovillage ministry in the Senegalese government, and they are looking at how to implement a lot of these principles across villages in Senegal. So it's very exciting things happening there. Dancing Rabbit is a community in Missouri that I think this, Sky, you probably know more about Dancing Rabbit than I do. I think there's about 70 people there. They might describe themselves as sort of an eco-feminist collective. The thing I liked about Dancing Rabbit is that they were developed by some graduates of Stanford, and they were maybe a little heady about it. They sort of created their ideal version of a community, but what I thought they did was very humble. Most people who have this idea of creating an ecovillages go off and say, well, we're going to create it. We're not doing anything like anyone else is doing, and we're going to do it on our own. And instead, what Dancing Rabbit did is they situated themselves near another community called Sandhill, which had a very active business with sorghum and some other things, and were able to take on some of the surplus business from Sandhill. And so they sort of apprenticed to this other community. Now, Dancing Rabbit, I believe, is bigger. It's quite a bit bigger than Sandhill. But I thought that was a very wise thing that they do, and actually fairly rare in the eco-village movement. And just one or two more, is that it? Oh, and then so there's lots more out there. And so here's just some names. You may have heard of The Farm, which is probably the quintessential hippie commune in Tennessee, Lost Valley in Washington, and places around the world, Crystal Waters in Australia, Tamara in Portugal, all over. And this is just a sampling of what's out there. And so personally, I'm so excited about ecovillages because you can learn anything there, right? I mean, really, life happens in ecovillages. And so you can teach sustainability in academia at universities, but what I find is students often come up against the infrastructure of the university, the hidden curriculum, or the meta narrative of the university, which is often antithetical to these ideas of sustainability. So students are saying, yeah, you're telling me all these things, but look around you, we're not living this. Whereas in ecovillages, you go there and you almost don't have to say a word. You're learning just by integrating into that community, into that system. So with that, you can find out more about Jen and Ecovillages at www.ecovillage.org. And if you want to connect with me personally, I'm Daniel at cape.consulting, and there's also the website, cape.consulting. So how'd we do, Sky?
That was great.
Okay.
That was great. Yeah, no, that was awesome. Yeah, I mean, I love seeing the pictures. I mean, you always have such great pictures of these eco villages around the world that, you know, I think really do capture this sense of the similarity, you know, of across cultures, across languages. You know, there's something that we're all still kind of going for, no matter, you know, all the different ways that it might look. So it's always beautiful to see those photos. So yeah, so I mean, we can go into a Q&A session now. So again, for those of you watching and listening, if you want to use the chat function to ask questions, or the actual Q&A function, which you should find in the bar down at the bottom of the screen.
Can I stop sharing now?
Yeah,
so
sure.
Everyone's got that if they want it, and I can go back, and this way I can see the chat as well.
Yeah, and then if you are interested in being seen and heard, what you can do is over if you click on participants down in the bottom of your screen, and then find yourself over on the right, there's a way you can raise your hand, and that will let me know that you would like to jump in, or you can you can just say in the chat that you'd like to talk, and can get you in that way. So go ahead, and if you got written questions you want to do, chat or Q&A, or indicate if you'd like to talk. While people are maybe thinking about that, I'll throw a question at you, Daniel. One thing that I've been thinking a lot about is, or that people have been commenting a lot about in presentations and stuff that I've been giving this year, is around the term sustainability, and how it seems to have it's gone a little out of vogue, if you will, or seen as co-opted, or one of the most common responses is, well, sustaining what? And so there's an interesting thing. I think it's both sides, right? We want to find words that are meaningful, that do speak to people, and at the same time, we don't want to get too caught up on the terminology, and we want to be seeing beyond it to the essence of what it is that we're getting at, despite whatever word we happen to be using. So and I know regenerative is sort of one of the more hot terms these days. People talk a lot about resilience. That's definitely a key term. So curious for your thoughts around that.
Yeah, I do have thoughts around that, surprisingly. For me, if I had to boil it all down, sustainability, regeneration, ecovillages, permaculture, if I had to boil that all down to one word, for me, it would probably be interdependence. Or better yet, there's a Buddhist term called interbeing, which is the idea that we are interbeing, that we viscerally are connected to everything else. And to me, that's at the core. And the central question that I think we can ask ourselves, the organizations and communities that we're involved with, is, are we telling stories of relationship? Are we telling stories of connection? Or are we telling stories of separation and distance? And to me, that's the essential difference. And you look at our government now in the US, and it time and time again, it's story of separation, right? You're not one of us, you're out there, you're not rich, all these things. Whereas ecovillages are trying to live lives where we're recognizing that fundamentally, we are connected to the people around us, we're connected to the environment around us. And if we live that way, if we really live that story, we will be sustainable. So to me, that's almost the worldview that underlies it all. I don't find it getting a whole lot of traction. I don't know, maybe it seems kind of woo-woo to a lot of people. But if there's anything that science has proven in the last couple hundred years, is that we are in this web of relationships and that everything is connected to everything else. So to me, it's actually also bridges that secular and spiritual side of saying, look, this is something I think we can all agree on, that we are interdependent. Now, how do we live that? I see a couple things coming in.
Yeah, we got a couple of things here, but I just want to say, I remember back in March, we were at a gathering together talking about the movement, and I remember you saying then about interdependence as sort of a crystallizing key term, and that definitely struck me. I resonate with that.
You'll probably hear me say it again.
Yeah, I'm sure I will. You might hear me say it back to you.
that would warm my heart.
So one question here, I am in Las Vegas. Is there an eco-village near me? Well, I'll just,
yeah, you're probably
of course, there's the communities directory on ic.org. So you just go to ic.org, go to the communities directory. What I often suggest people do is, if you're interested in a particular area, there is a map function. And so you can just sort of zoom in on the map where you are, and it will show little flags for the communities that are in that area, and you can sort of zoom in or zoom out as far as you want. Right. So that's great. And then, of course, you can also, ecovillage.org also has a directory, so you can look there. There are sometimes, there's not 100% overlap, though, as Daniel mentioned. That is one of the things that we're looking at more closely, is how to merge these so that we're sharing data and pulling from similar sets, so that we're on the different platforms. So
and then also, just to mention, you, Sky, you and I were both at a meeting in Arco Sante, which is an amazing community, about an hour north of Phoenix. I don't know how far that is from Las Vegas. I imagine a few hours. But if you have an opportunity, it's really an interesting community to visit, and their ambitions are quite large. But even just the little percentage of what they have there is quite impressive.
So the next question we got here: how are ecovillages addressing overpopulation? The ecovillage footprint cannot diminish globally with an ever-expanding number of humans. That is a Great question.
Yeah, and I actually think, I wonder if you'd be a good person to answer that, because I mean, I remember, I'll mention something and then I'm curious what you have to say. Because when I was doing that traveling around to communities, one of the places I stayed at was Twin Oaks, which, Sky, that's where you are right now, right?
Well,
And,
close,
oh,
but yes.
close. Okay. And I remember, well, one of the things at Twin Oaks is I think you needed to get permission before having a child. I don't know if that's still true, but I think it was true back then. And it was really interesting that, and Twin Oaks always put a lot of resources toward the kids, to the point where people who didn't want kids actually felt like they wanted more parity. Like, I remember one person saying, well, look, so and so has a kid, we're putting all these community resources to them, I want an oboe. Or I want the community, I want something that, I don't have a kid, but I want some of those resources. So it's an interesting question when we start thinking beyond our own personal choices. I mean, we always think of children as something, well, you don't get into that with other people, right? That's their choice. And it's often the third rail when you talk about international politics. You don't, it can be very volatile. And a lot of people say, well, the way to do it is if you increase quality of life, education, especially for women, that tends to decrease population. And certainly ecovillages are doing all those things. And in ecovillages, I have no idea how often this happens, but I do know people that chose to have fewer or no children because they had deep and persistent relationships with children in the community, and that part of them that wanted to be sort of a parent was filled up in that way. So I often think, I reflect on the fact that for 99% of our evolutionary history, we lived in tribes, we lived in communities. There were no strangers. It's only the last 150 years or so that we've sort of gotten away from that. And today, it's actually very difficult to have friendships with children if you're not a parent, or you don't have relatives or friends that have kids. Whereas in most of our evolutionary history, that was the norm. And to me, that was the biggest thing that came out of my dissertation, was those informal relationships between children and adults who weren't their parents or their teachers or their friends' parents or their parents' friends. And those relationships are profound. And unfortunately, they're also rare. And so I don't know if this is quite answering the question, but I do believe that the more we live into community, I think the quality of life goes up, and people don't feel a need to have children for their own sufficiency. But also, I think that need to be in relation multi-generationally is also filled up as well. Do you have more to say about that,
Yeah,
Sky?
well, I mean, I just to highlight a couple things, and maybe to sort of put anyone's mind at ease who was disturbed by the idea of needing to get permission to have a kid. It is true, there
Oh, yeah.
is technically an approval process at Twin Oaks for having a kid, but the assumption is that we will say yes. There has to be some pretty major red flags for us to slow down that process. We've almost never done it as a community. But I mean, the way I often talk about it is that, as an income sharing community, I mean, Twin Oaks is one of the few income sharing communities, at least in the US. It's like financially, it's like a 100-person family. And so, any couple, presumably a normal sort of couple having a kid is doing whatever family planning they're doing. So you just imagine doing that family planning with 100 people instead of two, which might also be a scary proposition. But after having spent a lot of years at Twin Oaks, I can say it's almost always gone very well. And I think the prospective parents always appreciate it. But yeah, I mean, just to highlight what you're saying, I mean, I think lots of people at Twin Oaks really do appreciate that we do try and maintain something like a 5 adult to 1 child ratio in the community. And yeah, lots of people really appreciate that from the perspective of being able to have connections with kids without having to have them themselves. And yeah, that interplay between the elderly and the kids at Twin Oaks, and all the generations is certainly pretty powerful, and definitely in part a product of income sharing as a model, because it just means that we are all responsible for caring for each other, essentially. And so if you're a child, if you're an elderly, if you're sick, whatever, like, you're going to be taken care of in the context of that community. So I think there are some pressures there that get relieved that help with this sort of thing. But yeah, also highlight that I remember reading in Yes magazine ages ago that there's very strong correlation between education of women and reduction of population and ecological conservancy. There was, it just happened. So if you imagine that eco-villages are helping to do better education in the world, or at least can, that's also certainly part of the
Yeah.
solution.
Some of the people in the webinar might be familiar with Paul Hawken's new book, Drawdown. And he basically goes through the 100 most effective actions we can take for climate change. And the first one was surprising. I think it had to do with not refrigerants, but like air conditioning or something surprising that could actually make a huge difference. But I think number 3 was education of women. And I love that, because so many people, when you think about climate change, it's like, oh, we have to pull down carbon dioxide. And yes, obviously we have to do that. But this is showing that, look, there's other things that we need to do that aren't just about the climate, but actually positively impact the climate and do so much more. And we'll never know. When you educate a girl in a village, you can't measure how much carbon dioxide that's preventing from going into the atmosphere. And yet it's the right thing to do.
Right. Question here, are most eco-villages sharing income? Follow up on what I was saying before, I'm imagining. And my understanding is that in the US and Europe, at least, the answer is no. The vast majority are not. But I'm curious, Daniel, how does that sort of, the finances and economics play out in other parts of the world?
Right. Yeah, it varies. I know that there's a couple a lot of kibbutzim used to be income sharing, and that's been shifting over the years. There's still a few of them. I know one in the Negev that's doing that. And then the larger communities like Findhorn and Oroville, typically people have their own purse, but there are experiments, there are pockets within those. So for example, Findhorn created its own internal currency, and that really has helped wealth stay local. And there is a group that has been experimenting with supporting each other economically, and that's a larger effort within Oroville. In fact, there's a whole store in Oroville that it's the free store. And if you're part of this collective that doesn't get your own payment, you can go to the store and essentially take whatever you want. You sort of have to write it out and saying what you're taking, but it's done on a gift economy, and there's a lot of trust there. So often there's experiments happening within eco-villages, but typically people are expected to be in charge of their own income. It's a positive aspect of an eco-village if it can support its members. Many eco-villages, people have to work outside of the community. So it's actually a nice threshold that they can get to if there's enough revenue to actually hire people within the community.
I mean, it seems like there's also, eco-villages have a little bit more of a tendency in this country as well to support small businesses or entrepreneurship within the community. By contrast, most co-housing communities in the U.S. at least, there's virtually no income generation, financial business sort of things, other than telecommuting, people having home offices in most co-housing communities. Whereas I think, I'm thinking about Earth Haven in North Carolina, I'm thinking about LA Eco Village, Sirius with its retreat center and different things. Like it is a little more common that while people are still financially independent and it's up to them to provide what they pay in what they need as membership fees, there is more of that sort of economic activity happening in eco-villages as opposed to some other models of intentional community.
And also, that reminded me, I probably should explain, some people might be curious about what they're seeing on the walls here. They're actually moving pads, and they're there because I've created a home studio, because a side gig that I'm creating is doing audiobook narration and other voiceover work. And one of my visions is that I retire in Oroville and maybe create an underground kind of studio there. But, that's so economically, but also things are changing very quickly. And many people are anticipating, it may not be in the next 10 years, but maybe 20 or 30 years, that experiments with UBI, Universal Basic Income, are going to become more popular. And they're already experimenting with it in Ontario. I think Sweden or Norway is experimenting with it. And all of the signs are pointing toward a positive aspect of that. And to me, a lot of people say, oh, well, if people don't have to work for their income, people are going to be lazy and do drugs or play video games all day. And yeah, there's probably a few people that'll do that. But to me, I think it will usher in a whole renaissance. I mean, think about what even you would be doing in this world if you didn't have to earn income. I mean, blessings to those of us who are able to marry those and do what we really love and make an income on it. But I think if there was just a basic income and you could even pool that together into communities and you could do what you're passionate about, someone said that what we really need more of on this planet are passionate people. We need people who are woken up to their bliss and who are following it. And so I'm very excited about that. And I think eco-villages and communities could play a large role in how that moves forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've got another question for you. There, with looking at the Global Eco-Village Network and the work that it's doing with these different regions around the world, I'm curious, what is the kind of conversation within GEN and the organizing that's happening there around, basically around like kind of neo-colonialism and the extent to which even very well-meaning liberal, nonprofits, different sorts of things will come in with arrogant attitudes or just misconceptions, not understanding, having different priorities, that sort of thing, and to what the extent to which GEN is based in Europe, and Europe is the most active region. How is it sort of seeking to address those dynamics or make sure that they don't play out?
Right. It's a good question, and certainly on the GEN level, a lot of emphasis is put in the autonomy and independence of the regions, and GEN is really a support network for those regions. I'll tell you the story of Orville, which I mentioned earlier. And in the early days, there was a large percentage of the people who first came to Orville to help develop it were hippies from the US. And they didn't know about development. So they made all the mistakes. They were throwing money at villages and say, oh, you need a well, we'll build you a well, right? And of course, those relationships don't tend to work very well. And over the years, they learned. And now they have a very sophisticated village action group, which what they recognized is that there was an exodus of leadership within the villages, because if you're living in a village in India and you are rather intelligent and have particular skills, there's going to be a pull for you to move to the city so that you can get a better job and support your family better. So there was a dearth of leadership in these villages. And so what Orville has been doing over the last few years is working with the villages to say, let's identify what are the issues that are in front of you, and then who are the people here that could do something, and they're scaffolding the existing leadership there, and with education and support around those things. And I think that's doing very well. And so what I'm saying is that we can do not so great things with the best of intentions. And I'm fallible here too. I mean, when I became president of GEN, there was all these regions and we're talking about communication, and I'm like, okay, what we should do is we should have sort of parallel committees in each of these regions. So the IT, the information technology committee, the marketing committee, the fundraising committee. So people in each region can talk to each other as peers and really kind of share information. It seemed natural to me. And I got a lot of pushback, and I eventually caved because I realized this was a very top-down kind of, oh, this is how it should be done. And I was kind of coming forward with probably I don't know if I would call it colonial, but it was sort of a top-down perspective. And I was put in my place. I was saying, look, Dan, the regions are going to grow in the way they are. And so I had to let go of this desire for efficiency and, this elegance. I had these wonderful PowerPoints, I think I was using another system, but to show how all this could work. And it kind of fell flat. So I think there's a lot of natural, there's a strong immune system, I think, within GEN against colonialism, and it's a topic of conversation.
Great. Another little question here: what is the most important book to read to better understand eco-villages?
Oh God, I wish I had a book now that I could promote. There's a number of good books out there. There's Hilda Jackson wrote a great book. I can't remember. I should be looking at my shelf now. I think in terms of communities in general, I like Diana Christian's book. What is it called, Sky?
Creating Life Together.
Yeah, and that really is a very practical. It depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for something very practical, that's a great book, and it goes through the legal and the organizational stuff. If you're looking something more inspirational, something like Hilda's book, there's a number of books out there about ecovillages. Yeah, most of them are about individual ecovillages. Liz Walker wrote one about EVI. Jan Bang wrote some about in Israel. That's a pretty good book too. I don't know, do you have any recommendations?
Well, there, I'm actually doing a little plug here. So the bookstore,
Yes,
FIC's bookstore on ic.org. If you scroll over bookstore on the main menu bar and then scroll over to categories, Ecovillages is actually one of the categories for different books. So you can go and look at the selection of what we have there. I know there's the Ecovillage 1001 Ways to Heal the Planet, which came
that's the
out.
Hilda Jackson, I believe.
Oh, that's a Hilda.
Oh, no,
Okay.
no, no, no. I'm sorry. That's not. That actually came out more recently.
Yeah,
That's
it was a couple years
Kosha and
ago.
others. Yeah, and
Hmm.
that's nice. That's it's an edited volume. So I think I have a chapter in there about the history of Sirius, but other people, I think it was meant to look at sort of snapshots of ecovillages. I wouldn't use that as a roadmap, but more inspirational, I'd say.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a documentary, A New We,
Hmm.
that we also sell. That's looking at a number of different eco villages across Europe, in particular. Yeah, there's a bunch of good stuff. I think it is true that Diana Christian's Creating a Life Together is still kind of the best practical how-to guide out there for starting a community. But I think if you're wanting to get sort of an overview of what it is, what this whole thing is about, I think that Eco Village, 1001 Ways to Heal the Planet, also Re-inhabiting the Village is
Yep.
another
Jamaica
nice one.
Stevens.
Mhm. So yeah, there's definitely a few really really good ones
And
there.
then, if you look at those, and actually, if you download the curriculum for Guy Education, there are resource sections or sort of an annotated bibliography, I think, at the end of each of those dimensions, or maybe even at the end of those modules. So if you are particularly interested in the environment or governance or things like that, you can also drill down and find resources that are particularly attuned. There's a great book I read a few months ago called Reinventing Organizations. Frederick Laloux is his name, and that's really looking at sort of new ways of thinking. This is also a hot topic within communities, as many of them are making decisions through consensus, and we're also realizing some of the limitations of that. And so sociocracy and other more holistic ways of organizing ourselves are starting to show up, and it's interesting. It's
Hmm.
great to see a
Hmm.
lot of variety around that.
Hmm. Um, if there are any more questions out there, chime in. I think we're getting close to being done with our Q&A session here. I have another question, or at least sort of a prompt. I'd like to hear a little bit more from you, Daniel, about Jen's connection in the United Nations and the work that is happening there to try and really bring that in that international forum.
Yeah, I wish I could say much more about that. I was a representative for Guy Education for a while, and I went to some trainings in New York around that. This is something that Jen has had for a while. I think what officially they have consultative status in ECOSOC, and I'd have to look it up to remember exactly what that stands for. Um, and one of the efforts that we're really looking at now is how to align our efforts, or at least translate what we're doing within the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. You might remember before these were called the Millennial Goals, and now they're the SDGs. And I think there's maybe 17 or 19, I can't remember, of them. And these are the things that governments are really focusing on, and they're quite good. And of course, ecovillages are hitting almost all of them. I had a slide that I didn't put in that was looking specifically about the SDGs, so I could find that and throw it up. But the general idea is there. So the UN is a whole other way of connecting to social ventures around the world that are looking similarly, and also Jen has had tables and has made presentations at a lot of the COPE conferences, and that's become a big thing. These are the I think they're annual now, of climate conferences where governments and representatives from the UN come together, and Jen has sometimes connected with others and have had booths and things, and they've been very popular. So people are very excited about what Jen is doing, and I think we're actually at the early stage of Jen's impact in that within the UN. I think that's going to be a growing impetus for Jen. And actually, I should say that this has also been a tension. I remember I was at a conference in Senegal a number of years ago, and Uso Ndour, who many of you know is probably the most famous musician in Africa, came and was very inspired and enthusiastic and said, I am an ambassador of Gen, give me my walking papers. What should I do? The challenge is he came with a whole bunch of government officials, and they kind of co-opted the event at that point.
Mm.
And all the things that we had planned sort of went out the window. And so it created a lot of aggravation within a lot of people saying, well, who are we? Are we about the grassroots, or are we about government? And it's been an active discussion. For me, as amazing as Ecovillages are, um, Ecovillages are not my purpose. You probably heard me say that back in March too. And this often shocks people, that you're like, wait, you're the president of Gen. This needs to be like core to your purpose. And my sense is Ecovillages are amazing, and I love them, and I support them, and I want them to grow. But the reason I'm excited about Ecovillages is that they are the best manifestation of this interdependent impulse of how do we live in relationship to each other and the planet. And it's that impulse that drives me forward. And if I see that impulse in a government or in another organization that we can partner with, I want to follow that. It doesn't have to be in the form of an ecovillage. I want to look at what is that is creating it. And so I think there's a lot of people in the UN that are thinking similarly. So that's exciting.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's always the danger of being co-opted or that sort of thing when you start working on that kind of level. But I certainly appreciate that Jen is doing that work to really try and engage with governments. I mean, coming from much more of a U.S. perspective, where I think here it just feels so impossible.
Yeah.
But from the number of communities that I visited in Europe, and how much government grants and different sorts of things tend to be much more accessible. And I was like, oh, interesting. If you were doing this intentional community thing in a place that wasn't government and local culture, that was more friendly,
Mm-hmm.
what then all of a sudden becomes possible. So I think knowing that there is that level of engagement happening in other countries and on the level of United Nations, I mean, it's certainly
There's
something
hope.
yeah, it absolutely helps give me hope. And yeah, so certainly, again, part of why I think it's important for folks in the US to know that there is this whole international thing happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One more question, and I think maybe we'll go ahead and wrap up. What is the most common or most successful governing style in small eco-villages?
Oh, geez. Well, this is probably not so different from intentional communities in terms of governance. I remember, again, when I was traveling around to communities, I was surprised that there wasn't more democracy. What I tended to find were communities that either worked on consensus, or there was a charismatic or powerful leader that everyone just followed, right? And when I thought about it more, I realized that it kind of makes sense, because in a nation like the US, democracy works because we have a military, and even if 51% of the people want something, it can be enforced, right? Well, eco-villages and most intentional communities espouse nonviolence, and we don't want to coerce people. So what do you do when only 51% of a population wants a certain direction? It's typically not going to happen, right? Because if 49% of people don't want something, either consciously or unconsciously, it will be subverted.
Mm-hmm.
So in communities, they either have some sort of supermajority or consensus or I think an up and coming form of decision making is sociocracy, consent-based decision making, which looks a lot like consensus, but it's different in some important ways. We're actually experimenting with that. I'm trying to bring that in fact, next month we're going to evaluate, we've been doing it for a year, of how sociocracy has been working within the Gen board. So it's an ever evolving space, and I think you wouldn't be able to say that, well, eco-villages are this or that, other than I find that just a majority vote doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, so often lately when people have asked me this kind of question, or what's the best conflict resolution method, or this sort of thing, increasingly my response has been, it's the one that the whole group is on board with.
Right.
it's the one that everybody has agreement to use and are engaged in the process of it. And I think the other thing is, any governance model is going to be undermined if you're not paying attention to the relationships. Like if the connections between people are not good, they will find a way to make the most perfect system fail.
Yes. We're funny that way.
All right. Well, any last thoughts from you, Daniel? Anything you want to leave us
Yeah,
with?
maybe I'll end sort of where I began, in that there's a lot of shit going down on this planet,
Yeah.
and we are at an incredible moment, not just in human history, but really in planetary history. And my basic belief is that we will not move toward a sustainable future, a regenerative future, out of fear. And that's what we see primarily in the US with Trump, that he's a fearmonger. And I think that leads to separation. And I think what is eventually going to get us there is love, is excitement. And that's what I appreciate so much about eco-villages and intentional communities, is that these are things people can say yes to. And they're actually fun. You can look at an eco-village and say, wow, that looks like more fun than what I was doing over here. And I think that is what is going to drive us toward a better future together. So yeah, thank you for your opportunity to do a webinar.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's great to yeah, again, get that international perspective.
Thanks everyone who came to the webinar, and anyone who's listening afterwards. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me.
Do you want to say real quick what's the way to contact you?
Oh, so Daniel at cape.consulting. I know consulting is a strange, it's not .org or .com, it's cape.consulting.
Great. All right, well, thanks everyone. Look out for announcements for next month's webinar, and happy holidays, if holidays are the thing that you're doing right now. And yeah, see you next time.